different kinds of different experts, teachers on different facets of research methodology. And I also welcome all the participants in this session. I will talk on research philosophy, methodology, and method. And nowadays, you can find that in every university, almost in every university, students are eager to complete their PhD, complete their research work just after completing master's degree. And they face the great problem at the very initial stage of their research. What is research, and from where to start our research? What should be the starting point of our research? And I think research simply refers to a process of steps used to collect information, to analyze those information, to increase our understanding about the existing body of knowledge on a specific topic or a specific question or a particular domain of research. It is a systematized effort. It can be defined as a systematized effort to gain new knowledge or verify our understanding about the existing knowledge. So research is thus an original contribution in the existing stock of knowledge. The purpose of research is to discover, is to obtain answers to questions through the application of scientific procedure. The main aim of research is to find out the truth, which is hidden and which has been discovered as which are yet to be discovered. So thus research consists of three basic steps: posing a question, collecting data to answer that question, and presenting an answer to the question. But the whole enterprise depends upon the philosophy on which it rests, what is simply called the research philosophy. Let us find out why it is so important, how it works. A research philosophy refers to the framework that guides us how research should be conducted based on ideas about the reality and the nature of the knowledge. There are two major research philosophies: positivism and interpretism. The two philosophies represent two fundamentally different ways in which we can make sense of the world around us. Positivism refers to the doctrine that man can have no knowledge of everything but the objective phenomenal reality, and that the knowledge of phenomena is the result of objective apprehension. You know, Auguste Comte made this philosophical positivism the cornerstone of his sociological thought. Positivism of later thinkers like Spencer, like Maine, McLennan, Tyler, and even Morgan, was simply a belief in the universality of natural causation. On the other hand, the interpretivism, reality is seen highly subjective, because it is shaped up by your perceptions about reality, which may not be the actual reality itself. And positivism originated in the natural sciences and focuses on scientific testing of hypotheses and finding logical or mathematical proof that derives from statistical analysis. Positivists therefore tend to use large sample size and to produce precise, objective, and quantitative data. This research study is underpinned by the interpretivist research philosophy. The interpretivism emerged as the result of perceived inadequacy of positivism to meet the needs of social scientists. It is concerned with exploring the complexities of social phenomena to achieving an empathic understanding of how the research subjects view the world based on the findings from the relatively small sample size. Such research design aims at interpreting findings in order to generate theories about the nature of the problem and its possible solution or intervention. It is very interesting that still there is another philosophy, another research philosophy, which is called neo-positivism. The school of neo-positivism traces the origin to statistical tradition rather than Koch's philosophical positivism. Dodd, Ogburn, Jeep are considered to be the major proponents of neo-positivism. And these neo-positivists take phenomena from the physical world as models of viewing social events, social things, and use the laws of physical world to explain the social events. Neo-positivists consider sound scientific methodology to be the first principle of analysis of social events. Among the early thinkers, for example, Pareto and Giddings, the sociologists, early sociologists, traced on scientific nature of sociology and recommended the use of methods commonly adopted in the natural sciences. Thus, the neo-positivists, for the neo-positivists, sound scientific methodology involves mathematical and other formal models that incorporate formalization of variables. You know variables? Variables means a factor that have multiple values in the society or in a population. For example, age. You can have a range of ages, a persons with wider range of ages, or sex. You can have male, female, or transgender in a population. Or for example, you can consider political affiliation. So you can have a lot of people who have affiliations to one or the other political parties like BJP, the CPMs, the Trinamuls, and other parties. So all these factors may be considered as variables because these have multiple values in the society. The neo-positivists, for the neo-positivists, computer techniques, language, experimental logic, laboratory experiment, computer simulations of human behavior are the major methods, for them. And what is the major features of neo-positivism? The neo-positivists positivistic epistemology. The neo-positivism rejects a priori definitions of the essential nature of society, culture, social structure, and institutions, and insists on operational definition of concrete phenomena. This is because there is difference between the actual concept and the perceived concept, perceived actual facts and the perceived idea about the facts. Operationalism. The neo-positivists are not satisfied with the vague definitions of theoretical constructs and concepts. Each term must be defined precisely and translated in measurable variables. So they emphasized upon the quantification or measuring attributes of data. You know data. Data means I want to mean the information which are related, which are relevant to of your research, of relevant to a research question. So it is very likely that what information is good data for you may not be a data for the other researcher, because his or her research question or research topic or research problem may be different. So the relevant data, relevant information or data may vary with the nature of research work or the research question. The neo-positivists. For the neo-positivists, a theory is a systematic collection of concepts useful in the interpretation of statistical findings. And quantitativism, it is the statistical analysis which incorporates enumeration and measurement is basic to neo-positivism. So due to the advances in computer technology, a variety of methods and techniques are available. So hence, the need is to put together the pieces of information pertaining to units of social structure into formal and mathematical system, so that the relationship between different variables may be ascertained. Empiricism, whether it is survey, research, or experimental observation, the empirical work falls into the standard pattern. A research problem is set in the way so that it can be investigated by a fact-finding inquiry. A set of hypotheses is formulated, which can be tested on the basis of individual responses to a set of questions. It may be structured or unstructured, and responses or answers are collected by means of a interview schedule or questionnaire, usually structured questionnaire. Another important feature is behaviorism. The behaviorism, it is the emphasis on the operationalism and quantitavism, because the neo-positivists tend to study observable behavioral pattern in a population or in the study population. They concentrate on specific instances of interaction, sometimes counting the frequency or the patterns of repetition. Substantive problems of social structure and the history of institutions and ideas are often ignored and concrete behavior of individuals become the focus of inquiry for a researcher who are working from this research philosophical background. They also use mathematical theory constructions for testing their hypothesis. So they say to mathematical formulations and sometimes employ different mathematical formulas to fulfill their objectives, to justify their statement, to justify their research argument. However, the critics of neo-positivism call such formulation as meaningless jumble of numbers and formulas. This is because the question is, this is because there is a question. The question is, what would be the research towards viewing knowledge? What would be the approach towards viewing knowledge? The neo-Kantian philosopher William Windelband suggested two distinct approaches for perceiving knowledge, each one corresponding to a different intellectual tendency, and each one corresponding to a different branch of academics. These two approaches are: the first one, nomothetic. What is nomothetic? It is based on what Kant described as a tendency to generalize. There is a tendency to generalize the observations, and it is typical for the natural sciences. It describes the effort to derive laws that explain types or categories of subjective phenomena in general. And the second one, ideographic. What is ideographic? This approach is based on what Kant described as a tendency to specify, to particularize, and it is typical for the humanities. It describes the effort to understand the meaning of contingent, unique, and often cultural or subjective phenomena. So it tries to locate the specific qualities of information on a specific topic or subjective phenomena in the society. However, the researchers in social science feel the problem of whether to use nomothetic or ideographic approach. This is because their subjects are unique individuals. That means ideographic perspective, but who have certain general properties or behave in accordance with the general rules of the society, that is nomothetic. So often, nomothetic approaches are quantitative and ideographic approaches are qualitative, though there are many researchers who prefer to combine the both. For example, Shapiro, for example, Conard, Freeman, and many other scholars, many other critics. Unlike quantitative research, there is common approach within the positivist or neo-positivist research philosophy. Qualitative research allows for a flexible data collection process. It is flexible. For example, data can be collected in several stages rather than at one time. The researcher may decide to add or leave out certain questions on the basis of learning what happens during the process of interaction with the informants or respondents. So he or she enjoys some freedom to modify his operational processes in research. Moreover, qualitative research lets the researcher continue collection and analysis of data until the researcher finds that no new issues are emerging. For example, Denscombe 20414. In qualitative research, data consists of words or visual images collected on the basis of observation and interaction with participants. So these are these cannot be quantified. These are the expression of attitudes, sentiments of the informants or respondents, and the general principle, general mode to express their sentiments is the verbatim text in which the researcher, in which the informants or respondents express their ideas, express their perception about the reality. Now the question is, then how we can design our research? Research design means the plan, the strategy, or the scheme of a research, commonly referred to as the which is framed in such a way that it would enable to collect and analyze data in order to fulfill the objectives of the research, the objectives of the researcher, or to answer the research question. So research design may vary on the basis of number of contacts with the study population, reference period of the study, whether it is conducted in the same at a given point of time or in different times, or in other words, we use the term synchronic or diachronic perspective, or the nature of investigation. So based on application, the commonly used research design are cross-sectional. Cross-sectional research draws on collection of data by observing many subjects, such as individuals, farms, a section of population, various ethnic groups or regions at the same point of time, or without regard to differences in time. So data in cross-sectional research are collected for a single time point or single space point. So this type of data is limited in the sense that it cannot describe changes over time. In case of longitudinal design, that is, it draws on the before and after. It is usually it is sometimes called as the before and after design. It is appropriate for measuring the extent of change in a phenomena, situation, problem, or the like. That means it draws on the data collected over different time frame. It is basically diachronic in nature. You are collecting data at a given point of time, for example, in 2010, and now you are comparing the data collected in 2020, or like this. So with an equal time or in different time framework, you collected data and you are going to compare those data to test your hypothesis. Still, there is another framework, another design, which is usually called time series design, and this type of data is usually called time series data. For example, you can compare and verify the growth of death ratio caused by COVID-19 in different weeks in a month. For example, in the first week of May, the death ratio in the second week of May, at the end of the second week of the May, at the end of the third week of the May, and at the end of the fourth week of the May. And you can compare, you can draw a graph to show the pattern of increase or decrease of the death percentage of death in different times. Or you can make a comparative analysis on the rates of death in the first wave and the second wave with equal gaps in time frame. For example, the January 2020 and January 2021, February 2020, February 21, and like this. This type of design is called time series design. Spatial design, it itself expresses it is related to space, it is related to location. Usually it's also called geolocation. It is related to geolocation. For example, the rate of infection or the extent of COVID infection is not same in the different geoclimatic zones of India. For example, in the northwestern part of the country, in the western part of the country, in the plain areas, and in the desert areas. So you can divide the entire country into different climatic zones or geophysical zones and collect the data on the nature of spreading and nature of fatality due to coronavirus. And you can make a comparison, and you may be surprised to know to find out that the rate of infection or the pattern of infection or the spread of infection is not similar all over the world. And scientists had come already, they come with the results that the people of northeastern India are less infected with this epidemic compared to the people of western India. And the scientist has explanation that certain factors, certain genetic factors are responsible for more susceptibility to this pandemic by the people of western India in contrast to the people of northeast India. And the people of northeast India has certain genetic factors which provide greater or better protection against this infection. So you can compare the data over the geological spaces of the same country, or maybe areas within different areas within the subcontinent or across the world, whether the pattern of spreading same all over the world or not, and if not, what are the factors responsible for that, so that we can discover the factors which can give us better protecting facility. So this type of research, this type of research design is called spatial design. Still, there are some important style of design. For example, experimental or non-experimental or quasi-experimental or semi-experimental. In the case of experimental design, the scientists usually select two groups of people for conducting the research. One is called experimental group or treatment group, and the other is called control group. And you know, during the trial of different vaccines, this kind of experimentation was conducted and still is being conducted. They select 100 groups, 100 peoples or 1000 peoples who are administered with a kind of vaccines. And the similar 1000 or 100 people who are who are living under the same conditions, but they are administered with placebo, the false vaccine. And peoples of both the group do not know, will not be enabled to know who is the person is getting the exact vaccines and who is not. And after a given point of time, the researchers analyze the results, whether the people who are vaccinated are less susceptible to the disease as compared to the people who are vaccinated with the placebo, that means the false vaccines. And they will come out with a result or observation that the people who are vaccinated are less susceptible to the disease, and they will come with a percentage of efficacy report. And you know, you are reading this report in different medical journals that the Covaxin has efficacy report of 81% and Covishield has 80% efficacy report. That means out of 100 persons vaccinated, 80 people are getting good protection against the disease, and 20% or 19% people are susceptible to the disease compared to the persons who are not vaccinated. 100% of them are susceptible to the disease. This is the experimental kind of work. And sometimes researchers also resorted to semi-experimental or quasi-experimental research. That means it combines both experimental and non-experimental effort. Interpretive research allows for a deliberate selection of research participants. Here the researchers mainly use purposive sampling to find and select research participants. You know, there are sampling techniques to select the informants. I will come to that portion later on. But before coming to that part, I will discuss some points about methodology. Methodology simply can be defined as the theoretically informed approach for the production of data, or the framework which provides the potential guide to the production of data to the researchers, for the researchers. So it provides a potential guide to you, or it provides a theoretically informed approach to the production of data. It will guide you to select what kind of information is relevant to you or not, what kind of information is not suitable for you or relevant to your topic of research or domain of research. In methodology, there are various points or issues for consideration. The first and foremost is the theoretical framework or the theoretical approach. a researcher can adopt one or more of the available approaches or can devise a new approach for production of his or her data in order to fulfill his objectives, in order to answer his research question, because he or she has started his research with a basic research questions initially. So here he or she has to collect information in order to fulfill his objectives. So for this purpose, a researcher has the liberty to choose one or the other approach, or to combine more than one approach, or to devise a new approach which would be helpful to him or her to fulfill his or her purpose. I am trying to explain this point with a few examples. This is because how a research framework, a theoretical framework, brings you different kind of data or enable you to collect different qualities of data. I'll start with the example of Max Gluckman. Max Gluckman introduced an important analytical and methodological approach, which was later called as situational analysis. Situational analysis. This approach draws on description and analysis of specific social or cultural events and processes to get at social relations, structures, institutions, and alliances, affiliations, and contradictions present in a particular society. In one of his most influential papers, entitled this called Analysis of a Social Situation in Modern Zululand, a South African country. Analysis of a social situation in modern Zululand. It was published in initially it was published in 1940, and later on it is again published in 1958. And Gluckman used the detailed examination of a bridge opening ceremony to explore structural relations and divisions between South African whites and blacks, underlining that the economic integration of Zululand into South Africa industrial and agricultural systems dominates the social structures. The whites and blacks, indeed, Gluckman observes, were parts of a single social system in spite of having different beliefs, customs, practices, modes of life, and that both groups had to cooperate and adapt to each other in specific socially determined ways. So, in the one hand, Gluckman observes there are inequality, there are differences, diversity in customs, beliefs, modes of life, and other things in their social and cultural life, but still they had to cooperate with each other for their social existence, for having their integration among themselves. And this approach to anthropology in connection with such conflict and cohesion has characterized the research approach later. Again, to illustrate how different theoretical approaches or framework can produce different data even on the same domain, I would like to refer to the critical assessment of Hegelians by Marx. You know, though the Hegelian idealism is of little or no interest nowadays, but it is still important in the historicity of social theories, as it provided the impetus behind the rise of critical theory, which is very important now the critical theory, but it has roots in the Hegelian philosophy. For Marx, the Hegelians are hopeless idealists in the philosophical sense. They saw the world as reflective of ideas with the dynamics of social life revolving around consciousness and other cognitive processes by which ideal essences work their magic on humans. So everything is ideal. They had given emphasis on the ideal things in the society, ideal behavioral pattern in the society, and usually they are usually referred to as the German idealists. Marx saw this emphasis on the reality of ideas as nothing more than the conservative ideology that supports people oppression by the material forces of their existence. Marx questions the relation between consciousness and self-reflection on the one hand and the social reality on the other. So he questions the self-reflection and the social reality, and he perceives the difference, perceives some kind of differences between these two things, the perception and the reality itself. And this dualism becomes central to the contemporary critical theory. For Marx, human beings are unique by virtue of their conscious awareness of themselves and their situation. They are capable of self-reflection and hence assessment of their positions in society. And such consciousness arises out of people's daily existential experience and is not a realm of ideas that is somehow independent of the material world as the German ideologists perceive. According to Marx, people produce their ideas and conceptions of the world in the light of the social structures in which they are born. They are born, they are raised, and they live. So it is Marx who held that the essence of people's lives or lives in the process of production for human, the essence of lives in the society is the process of production. For human life involves before anything else, eating, drinking, habitation, clothing, and many other material things. Marx used the idea as base and superstructure. You know that. The base is the economy, base is the system of production, and all other things are the superstructures like belief, like religion, like other things, values, etc. And to meet these contingencies of life, production is very necessary. But as production satisfies one set of needs, new needs arise and encourage alterations in the ways that productive activity is organized. The elaboration of productive activity creates a division of labor, which in the end is alienating because it increasingly deprives humans of their capacity to determine their productive activities. This approach leads to production of different data compared to the German idealists. I will like to give you another classic example in this connection. That means how different research framework, different theoretical framework produce different data and lead the researcher to come into different conclusions or different findings. This is studies on collaring. You know collaring? It is a Melanesian exchange system which involves the exchange of armlets and necklaces traveling in opposite directions, but always within the closed set of individuals linking the people of Eastern New Guinea and the neighboring archipelagos. So there is a exchange system operating in the fixed directions. For example, the armlets are going in the rolling in the clockwise directions, and the necklaces in the anti-clockwise directions among the inhabitants of different islands of the Melanesian islands. And the Kula is a central theme presented by tracing its interconnections with other cultural aspects like gardening, magic, canoe building, kinship, etc. upholds its adherence to customs and traditions governed by crystallized legal frame. It is very interesting to note that different approaches led to production of different data, which resulted in different conclusions. For instance, Harding in 1967 finds extensive ceremonial events as the most important aspect of colouring because of the survival of ordinary economic trade depended upon it. Thus, Harding applied the Fraser's utilitarian perspective. So he found out that the colouring has a utilitarian perspective or utility. It provides an economic utility for the inhabitants of the archipelagos. But in sharp contrast to this utilitarian approach, B.K. Malinowski recognized the symbolic meaning of the ceremonial exchange that is intended to strengthen a kind of network of interpersonal relationships among the different communities living in the archipelagos, and not to maximize the material benefit. It is not intended to get maximized economic benefit, maximized financial benefits through trades, but it provides a network of interpersonal relationships among the inhabitants of the islands. And it is designed to meet various socio-psychic functional needs of the individuals and the society. So it provides some kinds of socio-psychological and functional needs to the people and the society. On the other hand, another great anthropologist, Marcel Mauss, he sought to identify the force which compels a recipient to pay a return gift and recognize that the exchange transactions are normally governed and regulated by the collectivity, not the individuals. And this approach led to the origin of collectivist. The collectivist or structuralist orientation of modern exchange theory. So you can see that on the same issue, different anthropologists with different theoretical framework came out with different findings. Again, there is another great anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who is famous for his structuralism. He rejected both Fraserian utilitarianism and Malinowski's psychological interpretation. And he viewed the items of exchange as culturally defined and their values being extrinsic and symbolic. And thus for Lévi-Strauss, this exchange system provides a symbolic value to the people concerned. So thus you can see that applying different theoretical approach can produce different kind of data, which will lead you ultimately to different findings. So thus, in the beginning of your research, you have to choose one of the theoretical framework, one or more of the theoretical frameworks, or devise a new framework which will guide you to produce your data, which will make your eyes and mind fit to recognize the data. to select the data, to identify the data. And now, after selecting the framework or the developing the framework for your research work, the next important one is the study area, to choose the study area, to select the study area. And a researcher has to find out a suitable study area considering the nature of his or her research question or research domain, so that he or she can obtain the potential data to justify his or her research postulate or hypothesis. The area should be matched with the research design, whether cross-sectional or longitudinal or spatial, and so on. So we have to select the space, we have to select the area, keeping in mind the framework of your research. And the most important one in this sphere is the study group, selecting the study group. And selecting appropriate study group will enable you to obtain the required data in order to fulfill your research objective. The entire population or a section of that population may be studied depending on the depending on the availability of certain requirements. What is these requirements? The first one is time available for your research. Whether you will you can conduct your research for a year or two or more, or maybe within 6 months. So that will determine the size of your study group. And the second one is availability of funding. If you got a good amount of fund from the funding agencies, from any of the funding agencies like UGC, ICSR, ICMR, Indian Council of Historical Research, and others, and many other non-governmental funding agencies like the agency of Tata Institute of Social Science, and others, they also provide funding. So on the basis of availability of amount of funding, you will be in a position to select, to determine about the size of your study group. And the third important factor in this area, in this connection, is the research in the resources, human resources. How many of you and your co-workers are available for this research? That is again determined by the funding, amount of funding. So on the basis of all these three factors, all these three kind of resources, you have to choose, you have to determine the size of your study group. Whether you will select the entire population or a section of it. If a section is to be studied, first you have to sure sure about the representativeness of that portion or section of the population. And this representativeness is ensured by a scientific process which is commonly called as sampling. You know, there is a scientific process of selecting samples. It is called usually sampling. What is it? Sampling is a procedure of selecting a section of a population or things or elements which is part and adequate section of the whole, number one, and number two, which has the representativeness. That means the section or a part of the entire populations or things will represent the whole. Will represent the whole. So it must have the representativeness. sampling must be, and in selecting the samples, or in while you are determining about the sampling technique, you have to mention the exclusive and inclusive criteria. What are the peoples? What kind of peoples, or peoples belonging to different age groups or sex or other things, other social criteria will be included or excluded for your research. For example, you are intending to study on reproductive health of the school-going children aged 8 years to 16 years or 7 years to 16 years. So you are excluding all the other groups, all the other persons with different ages. So in this way, you have to explicitly mention your exclusive criteria and your inclusive criteria. What are the people you are included in your research, and what are the people you are excluded from your research? And you have to logically justify your arguments. Now the question is, what is the benefits, the advantages of sampling? I have already said it. It will save time and energy. It will save time, money. It will give you detailed study, and sometimes it will be provide you administrative convenience, because it will involve less people, less number of people, and you have to invest less time. And sometimes it helps you to avoid the impracticability of census data, because in census there is a huge data which cannot be applicable in some cases. Though there are many information available on the populations, but it lacks various information which is actually required for your research. So it provides you some advantage, or to avoid the practicability of the census data. So now the question arises that, is sampling is only good for your research? Does it have some negative aspects also, some disadvantages also? The answer is yes. It may provide you some kind of biasness in selecting the samples, and it bring you in difficulty to select a representative part, a representative sample, because to select a representative sample needs specialized knowledge, and sometimes you cannot make a sample on certain occasions. Sampling basically of two types, you know that. The first one is random sampling or the probability sampling, and the second one is the non-probability sampling or non-random sampling. What is random sampling? Random sampling is drawn haphazardly. It is drawn haphazardly in such a manner that each and every section, each and every part or item has an equal chance to be selected. There are some major techniques of random sampling. There are major types of random sampling. The first and foremost one, the simple random sampling. What is simple random sampling? It is the process of selection that gives each item and case an equal chance to be selected. So for this purpose, you can easily use the statistical chart. It is available in the backside or the last part of any statistics, any book on statistics. There is a computer generated chart of numbers which was produced randomly, so that it cannot it don't have any biasness, don't have any purpose. Stratified random, second one is stratified random sampling. If items and populations are hierarchical in nature, for example, our society, there is hierarchy. The peoples are categorized. You can categorize the people on the basis of their caste, basis of their age, basis of their sex, on basis of their ethnic groups, on the basis of their political affiliations, economy, and many things. So there are lot of differences among the peoples, and you can have different categories of people. So first we have to divide the entire study group into subgroups or subpopulations, and you can draw a random sample from each and every section, from each and every subcategories or subtypes, and these samples are then put together to get the uniform sample, to get the unified sample, and that will serve your purpose. And usually there are two types of stratified random sampling. If you select the number of individuals or parts or sections or households or families from each and every sections or subtypes proportionately, that means where more the layers, in the layers where there are more families, you will select more families. Where there are less families, you will select less. In the ratio, in a particular ratio. That type of random stratified random sampling is called proportionate stratified random sampling. And when you can also draw the number of items or items or families or households disproportionately. Say, for example, 20% of each strata or 10% of each strata, and you are putting together the selected households or families or items and will get the unified sample. This type of sampling is called disproportionate stratified random sampling. Again, there is a random serial sampling. Usually when we conduct a fieldwork on a certain community, on a particular community, we used to numbering the households or families with chalk or something else, like household number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. And you can determine that the 20% of the households or families will be selected for the study. That means you will select 1 out of 5. So you can select household number 1, 6, 11, 16, and in this way. Or you can select family number 2, 7, and like. So you can start your selection from any of the number, any numbered family. But there is the question of biasness. Why you have selected family number 1 or household number 1 or 2 or 3? What are the criteria? Whether your personal opinion, your personal readiness to choose a family or household matter. So that is the problem in this type of sampling. Another important type is systematic grid sampling. In this process, the entire geographical area of the field is divided into a number of grids, usually a square area or of equal size, or in a municipal area there are a number of wards. A municipal area is divided into a number of wards, and you can draw a random sampling, simple random sampling among the ward numbers. And depending upon the availability of sources, different kinds of sources, you can you will have to determine the what percentage of wards will be studied, and on the basis of that you can select 20% or 30% of the wards, and on the basis of the ward numbers you can get a grid, you can draw a grid sampling. A grid sampling is you can divide the whole area into square areas or in terms of the number of wards, and can draw a simple random sampling. So in this way you can select certain number of wards, certain ward numbers, or the certain areas for your study. This type of study is conducted usually by the archaeologists, the prehistorians, ONGC, when they unearthing for oil coup, they are also employing this type of sampling. Another important type is cluster sampling. Cluster sampling, it is almost like the stratified random sampling, but there is a very interesting difference between these two. It is drawn on, first you call for random sampling among the clusters. When a society is divided into clusters, like the caste hierarchy, there is a stratification. So you are conducting a survey, you are conducting a research on certain issues, certain questions of caste framework or caste hierarchy. So you can select one or two strata or stratum or strata of the society in terms of caste identity. It may be either simple or stratified, and then all the cases within a cluster are used, or random selections among the items or families or households within that cluster are taken together for your study. So you can select one or more than one clusters of the entire populations, and within the selected clusters you have to make a simple random sampling for choosing the exact number of families which are required for your study, which are permissible for on the basis of your availability of resources. Nested sampling, or it is also called multi-stage sampling. In this process, sample is selected in stages, where the sampling units at each stage are subsamples from the previous stage. For example, you first conduct a study on the basis of sex. You have selected the males or the females, and then you can select the persons within the age group of 18 to 24 within the selected sex, and like that. Or next, on the basis of political affiliations of the individual selected. So like this, you can pinpointing your selections of the individuals, keeping in mind the purpose of your study. For example, a public opinion poll. In this way, they can limit their observations on the various sections of the society. And the second type of sampling is the non-probability sampling or non-random sampling. As its name reveals, here not all the items has the equal chance. These are selected on the basis of sheer availability or availability by chance. So although this kind of sampling does not have the usual meaning of randomness, still one cannot ignore the usefulness or the applicability of this type, because there are certain issues, certain areas of research where this type of sampling has utility or usefulness. For example, accidental sampling. Such sample is selected generally for its sheer availability. For example, a professor selection, professor students. The question is, are these students are the representative group of the country or a university? No. These students get or got admission to the particular teacher on the basis of their choice and availability. So it is by chance they got admission into that particular admission under that particular teacher. Another one is quota or controlled sampling. In drawing such samples, it is tried to ensure inclusion of enough cases from each relevant sections of the society to permit analysis and conclusion and comparison. This is basically done in the public opinion poll. They try to include enough cases from each of the category or subcategory of the population to reach at a conclusion, working with a very small sample, working with a sample with a very small size, because it is conducted within a very limited time. Again, there is another type which is called purposive sampling. It is also called subjective sampling, because here the researcher selects a sample on the basis of a certain purpose. What is the purpose? That the particular section or the particular part of the population can have a unique character, a distinct character to fulfill your objective. So then you can select that type of population to testify your hypothesis or assumption. There is another very popular technique of sampling, non-random sampling, is snowball technique. Snowball technique, all of you have heard this term. It is used where potential participants are hard to find out. For example, you are working on some insurgency activities or terrorist activities or the sleeping cells of a terrorist group. So you will not be in a position to find out such populations. So then you have to try your own to find out at least one such person. And to find out the others from that person. It is called snowball sampling because once you have the ball rolling, it picks up more snow. When it's rolling over the ground, it picks up more snow. And like that way, you can choose one person's, and that person's give you the clue of another person, and from that person's, the second person, you can get the information of other person, any other person, and he or she may lead you to another one. So in this way, you can get a number of persons for your for serving your purpose. Snowball technique consists of two steps: identify potential subjects in the population. Or if often you can get one or two persons initially, and asking those subjects to recruit others persons. These steps are repeated until you get the required size of your sample. And now the most important part of research methodology is method, to select suitable methods and techniques. And before going to the methods and techniques, you should be very aware about the term methodology. It is the combination of both, and it provides an articulated, theoretically informed approach to the production of data. As I have already mentioned, that it will provide you the guideline to produce your data, to identify your data, to generate your data. For example, Marxist methodology, ethno methodology, like those. And there are many such examples. And the question is method and techniques are the same, or whether there are overlapping of each other? I think no. Method is quite different from technique. And then how can we define method? Method can simply be defined as the general mode of building data. For example, interview, observation, case study, genealogy, and like those. Every method has its own procedures, own processes, and you have to go by its own rules and structure and prerogative and limitations. And technique is a particular means by which you can make a method, you can make a particular method effective. How? For instance, when you are interviewing a person or group of persons in a group discussion, you can employ a interview schedule. You can employ a questionnaire, or a color chart, or a map. You can also use sound recorder or video. You can videography. You can do videography. So these are the techniques which will help you to take your interviews better, to record your data during interviews better in a very efficient way. So these techniques make your method very effective. So thus technique and method are quite different, are distinct, but each has its own advantages and disadvantages. So when a researcher go to the field or in an experiment, have to choose the method and techniques very cautiously, very consciously, so that he or she can get or collect suitable data which are relevant to their research, which are relevant to their research question or the domain of research. So there are some points. There are some important points in while you are devising your methodology for your research. The identification of the variables. What is the variables? As I have already said, variable means a factor, an element, a measure that have variable that have many values, different values in the society. It may be quantitative, it may be qualitative, it may be continuous or discontinuous or discrete, whichever the point of view from where we can consider this. While it is continuous, the data is continuous when in a population we can get the presence or existence of data in a continuous form, because for example age, you can have the persons having different ages, having continuous ages. For example, there are persons whose age is 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year and like. But you cannot use the sex of the persons in a continuous stage, because there are only a few categories. When in a population, the variables is the factors is categorized or is discrete, it is discontinuous, like ethnic groups, like sex, like political affiliations, and other things. So variables can be continuous or discontinuous, or in other way can be quantitative or qualitative. What is quantitative variable? The variables, the data which can be quantified, which can be measured. For example, age of a person, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year. The weight of a person, 1 kg, 2 kg, 4 kg, 24 kg, 50 kg, etc., etc. So these can be quantified, these can be measured. These are the quantitative data. But there are some data which cannot be quantified, which are qualitative. For example, sex of the population, sex of the persons, either male or female or transgender, or the population or the affiliation, political affiliation of the individuals in a society. There are some followers of TMC, some followers of BJP, some followers of Democratic, some followers of Republicans. They cannot be measured. The quality, the quality of affiliation, the degree of affiliations, the nature of affiliation cannot be quantified. You can quantify the number of a persons to a particular quality, to a particular character, but you cannot quantify the qualities of the items. And in a research, you have the liberty, you have the freedom to enjoy, to combine both qualitative and quantitative at the same time, or you can use only quantitative or only qualitative. For example, you are going to study the reproductive health behavior, or the dropouts, the problems of dropouts among a particular community. You can quantify the number of dropouts, the age of dropouts, but you cannot identify the causes of dropout from these empirical data. Why the early dropouts happen in a society, there may be different causes, different reasons. And for that purpose, we have to take case studies. Why case studies? You have to take case studies because different informants or respondents may have different unique causes, for their dropout. There may be some who had been dropouts because of early marriage. There may be some become early dropouts because of poor economic conditions, and there may be some other reasons also. So to identify the causal background of the problem, you have to employ qualitative data. You have to utilize qualitative data to identify the problem and to suggest intervention, adequate or required intervention. And while you are using the quantitative data or qualitative data, particularly when you are using the quantitative data, such data may be of different types again. On the basis of measurement, on the basis of nature of measurement, these data can be divided into 4 types. What are the 4 types? The ordinal data, the nominal data, the ordinal data, interval data, and ratio. What is the nominal data? Nominal data reflect or reveal the different categories in a population, the different subsets or subpopulations. As I have already said, the sex or gender, or the political affiliation, or the health conditions. These data are nominal. But in case of ordinal data, you can make a rank. These data can be ranked, or you can make an order. For example, the result of the students of a particular batch. There is one person who ranked first, then second, third, etc. So first is obviously the best of the students. Second is the best of the students except the first one. So these number 1, 2, 3, 4, these are reflecting the rank or order of the items. So it reflects it represents the quality of the items or ranking of the items. But if you consider the jersey number of a player of a cricket team or a football team, the best player is usually given number 10. Jersey number of Maradona is 10. Jersey number of Messi is 10. Jersey number of Ronaldo was 7 or 8. So it does not mean that the player who has the jersey number 1 is the best player of the team. This number only gives the identity, only marks the identity of the player. This number do not express the ranking or quality of the players. So these are the nominal numbers. Interval, what is the interval data? When you are grouped the data with certain interval, with a age group, with a period of years, etc. For example, we are drawing up the demographic data of a population in terms of age and sex. And we are grouping the populations below 5 years, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, 20 to 24, etc. And in the next column, it is male or female and their percentage or numbers. So these data represents the interval data because this data combines a population falling within an interval of age. Or you can you are comparing the populations of last population growth pattern. You are trying to draw the growth pattern of Indian population. So you can consult the census data of 2001, 2010, 2020, 20, or the previous one. So these decadal data you can use or compare the decadal data of the Indian populations. And these data actually represents the interval data because these data are of 10 years. And there are certain data which is called ratio data. For example, you are wanting to make a graph on the ratio of death to the number of infected persons in COVID-19 over a period, over the last 3 months or over the last 1 year. So you can make a graph, the January, February, in January, February, March, etc. And you can make a graph on the ratio of death to the infected persons. And you can came out with the results whether the growth of death is actually declining or increasing over a certain period of time. So these data is basically based on ratio per 100 infected persons, the number of the incidences of death per 100 of infected persons. So this data is called ratio data. So when you are manipulating the quantitative data, you can use any one or more or all type of data simultaneously. That is your liberty, your freedom. But you can have, you must have in mind that what type of data, what type of representation of data is most fitted to your objective. Is suitable, is befitting for your objective and to fulfill your purpose. And when you come to the stage of analysis of data, you have to choose the appropriate tool for interpretations. Earlier, the scholars or the researchers of social sciences usually employ MS Excel. Now you have the SPSS. So you can use the SPSS program to make a comparison to get the results of your analysis. And we will face one big problem in doing that. In connection with the qualitative data. And this is because The computer mechanism does not read the word, does not read the letters. It only understands number. So you have to assign a number against your qualitative data. For example, your populations have different age, male and female, different sex. So you have to assign a number 1 or 2 to male and female. And after getting the result, after getting the analysis, you have to decode the observations, and you will be able to say whether the males and females are getting a particular type of characteristics, a particular type of association or with certain problems. And these analytical tools, these statistical package also can help you to get observe correlation between various variables. You cannot, you don't need to, you don't need to make a manual comparisons, which may give you to incorrect result, poor result. SPSS can give you good results in terms of association between different variables. For example, you are wanting to know, is there any relationship or association between economic conditions and early marriage? The SPSS will come out with suitable results for you. We have to feed the data suitably. I will end my discussion with another important, another vital issue in conducting a research by the social scientists. It is the ethics of research. There is some ethical guidelines in conducting research by the various international organizations, more particularly the American American Anthropological Association, AAA, and they sets out certain guidelines, like you don't have the right to disclose the personal identities of the persons involved in your research. You don't have any right to hamper the personal interest of the research or the personal interest of the individuals or the community. And nowadays it is very essential, it is compulsory to get a written informed consent, informed written consent from the informants before starting your collection of data. How this? It contains a simple statements about what kind of data you are requiring from the respondents, and you are not going to disclose his or her personal identities or hamper their personal interests. And there should be a statement that you will use this data only for research purposes, and you can use the data for future publications without mentioning the personal identities of the persons involved. And they will declare that I have read the statements and are agree to provide the informations to the researcher. And they will put their signatures and name and date. And if the informant is not adult, then guardians will give the declaration that yes, they agree to give you the informations on their children, and they will put their signatures, and there will be the signature of their children also. And in case if the respondents or informants are illiterate, then there will be a witness of adult age. He will declare, he will give his sign, signature and name, etc. And there will be also the name and signature of thumb impression of the informants themselves. So it is now compulsory for social scientists because many of the leading journals are now ask for the declaration of the written consent, whether you have taken the written consent from the informants. And some journals also ask for producing some samples of the consent forms. So it is very compulsory to get the written consent before starting your research. But the big question is that the ethical positions of the social scientists when they contact on some social problems existing in a society. Is it possible to remain totally unbiased, totally immersed within the society, within the cultural life of the society? That earns very big debate about the total immersion within the field, like the Malinowski model, Malinowski tradition, whether it is possible to forget your own identity, own position, own sentiments, own approach about the society or the social problems, and to think and perceive the problem in line with the community members, what is called the ethnomethodology. That is another method, another framework, another approach. And secondly, whether it is possible to remain unbiased. That is a big question. And there are some figures, some leading figures who, for example, powder maker, who prefer to take the side of the informants, side of the people for their benefit. Because the social scientist must be some kind of humanistic position. They should take the side of the people themselves. So there comes a term, action scientist, action anthropologist, action political scientist, etc. So they are taking part in research, and at the same time, they are taking the side of the community to serve their interest, to make their life out of troubles, or to they take the side of the people to challenge the administrators or other forces, other powers who are posing potential threat to the community themselves. With this with this discussion, I think I should stop here and would like to express my thankfulness to all the participants for your patient hearing. And now I request you, if you have any comment, if you have any questions in connection with my deliberation,